Eleanor Vance considered herself a woman of simple pleasures. A well-brewed cup of tea, the scent of old books, the quiet satisfaction of tending her small container garden on the balcony of her city apartment. She wasn't an artist, not by any stretch of the imagination. Her drawings, when she bothered to make them, were usually little more than absent-minded squiggles during long phone calls or a roughly sketched layout for her herb pots. So when she found the pencil, it wasn't the promise of artistic expression that intrigued her, but its sheer peculiarity. It was tucked inside a second-hand copy of Household Hints from a Bygone Era she'd picked up at a dusty charity shop downtown. The book itself smelled of lavender and thyme, but the pencil was different. It was short, no longer than her index finger, made of a dark, unlacquered wood that felt strangely warm to the touch. It had no eraser. And carved into its side, just below where the lid emerged, was a tiny, almost imperceptible, smiling face. Not a cute, cartoonish smile, but something wider, a little too knowing, like a Cheshire cat that had swallowed a particularly unfortunate canary. Eleanor almost tossed it. It was just an old pencil stub. But something about that smile held her gaze. She pocketed it, thinking it might be useful for marking passages in her new book. That evening, curled up on her worn armchair, a half-finished crossword puzzle lay forgotten on her lap. Her mind drifted to the wilting basil plant on her balcony. She'd been meaning to buy a new, healthier one. Absently, she picked up the smiling pencil and on the margin of the newspaper, sketched a quick, rather lopsided drawing of a lush, vibrant basil plant in a terracotta pot. It was a terrible drawing, even by her standards. She chuckled, set the pencil down, and went to make tea. The next morning, as she opened her balcony door to water her struggling herbs, she stopped. There, nestled amongst her other pots, was a new terracotta container. And in it, a basil plant so perfect, so verdantly green and fragrant, it looked like it had leaped from the pages of a gardening magazine. It was the exact lopsided shape she had drawn. Eleanor stared, her mind struggling to connect the dots. A coincidence? Had her neighbor Mrs. Gable left it as a kind gesture? But Mrs. Gable was visiting her sister out of state. She touched a leaf. It was undeniably real, the scent pungent and fresh. Her gaze fell to the newspaper still on her coffee table, the poorly drawn basil plant in the margin, and then to the little dark wood pencil with its unsettling smile lying beside it. A shiver, not entirely unpleasant, traced its way down her spine. The logical part of her brain screamed impossible, but a smaller, more curious voice whispered, "Try again." That afternoon, she thought about the chipped mug she used for her morning coffee. It was her favorite, but the chip was annoying. She took the pencil and, with more care this time, drew her mug on a fresh sheet of paper, but without the chip, its pattern perfectly rendered. She focused, remembering the weight of it in her hand, the specific shade of blue. She drew it whole. She placed the drawing on her kitchen counter, pencil beside it, and busied herself for an hour, trying not to think about it. When she returned, her old chipped mug was gone. In its place, identical in every way, but now flawlessly intact, sat the mug from her drawing. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her. This wasn't a coincidence. This was something else. She picked up the pencil. The tiny carved smile seemed to gleam, to widen just for a fraction of a second. For a week, Eleanor experimented. Small things. A lost button for her favorite cardigan. A specific brand of biscuits she couldn't find at her local store. A perfectly ripe avocado when the supermarket only had ones hard as rocks. Each time she'd sketch it with the smiling pencil, and within a few hours the drawing would manifest. The original object, if there was one, would simply vanish. It was as if the pencil wasn't just creating, but replacing. The power was intoxicating, a quiet hum of control in her otherwise predictable life. She felt a thrill she hadn't experienced in years. The little pencil felt like a secret friend, a tiny smiling confidant that granted her small, harmless wishes. Harmless, that was the word she clung to. But the desires, as they often do, began to grow. Not out of malice, not at first, but out of convenience, then out of a creeping sense of entitlement. Her ancient rattling air conditioner finally gave out during a sweltering July heat wave. Repairmen were booked for weeks. Eleanor, sweating and frustrated, grabbed the pencil. She drew a sleek, modern, quiet air conditioning unit, the kind she'd seen advertised, perfectly installed in her window. Within the hour, the old noisy beast was gone, and cool, silent air filled her apartment. The relief was immense. The faint unease that accompanied it was easier to ignore. Then came the little annoyances of city life. The noisy neighbors upstairs who seemed to practice tap dancing at 3 a.m. Eleanor, sleep-deprived and irritable, drew a thick, luxurious, soundproof rug for their apartment floor, directly above her bedroom. She didn't draw it in her apartment, she drew it in theirs. The next night was blissfully silent. She never heard a peep from them about a new rug appearing. She tried not to think about how that worked. The smile on the pencil, she noticed, seemed more pronounced these days. Or perhaps it was just her imagination, fueled by a mixture of exhilaration and a low, thrumming anxiety she couldn't quite shake. The real shift, the one that nudged her from harmless into a grayer, more unsettling territory, happened because of Mr. Henderson's perpetually barking terrier from 2 floors down. The yapping was incessant, a high-pitched soundtrack to her days. Complaints to the landlord did nothing. One particularly frayed afternoon, Eleanor found herself sketching. Not the dog itself, but a high-tech, very expensive-looking, silent whistle dog training device she'd once seen in a fancy pet store catalog. She drew it placed discreetly near Mr. Henderson's apartment door in the hallway. The barking stopped, abruptly. Not just for that day, but for good. A week later, she saw a distraught Mr. Henderson putting up lost dog posters for his terrier, Patches. Patches, the poster said, had simply vanished from his apartment, even though the door was locked. Eleanor felt a cold clench in her stomach. She hadn't drawn Patches gone. She'd drawn a device to silence him. Had the pencil interpreted her desire in the most absolute way? Had it removed the source of the noise, not just the noise itself? The implications were deeply disturbing. The original objects vanished when replaced. What happened when the object was a living creature tied to a problem she wanted solved? She tried to put the pencil away. She hid it in a drawer, under a pile of old linens. But it was like an itch she couldn't scratch. The knowledge of its power, the silent, smiling invitation it offered, was always there, at the back of her mind. And life, as it does, continued to present problems. A promotion she felt she deserved at work went to a younger, less experienced colleague, Mark, who was adept at office politics. The injustice gnawed at her. Late one night, fueled by resentment and a glass of wine too many, the pencil was back in her hand. She didn't draw Mark gone. No, that was too much, too direct. Instead, she drew a letter, a transfer letter on company letterhead, offering Mark an incredible opportunity, a dream job in a branch office on the other side of the country. She drew it with his signature of acceptance at the bottom. 2 weeks later, Mark delightedly announced his transfer. He was a little puzzled, he admitted, as he didn't quite remember applying for that specific internal posting, but the offer was too good to refuse. He'd found the accepted offer letter on his desk one morning. Eleanor got the promotion. The victory felt hollow, tainted. The smile on the pencil now seemed almost predatory when she dared to look at it. It felt like it was feeding off something, her desires, her frustrations, perhaps even that little sliver of darkness that resides in everyone. She started having unsettling dreams. Dreams filled with half-formed sketches of faces with smiles that were too wide, of objects that twisted and morphed into grotesque shapes. She'd wake up with a start, the image of the pencil's tiny carved grin burned into her mind. The final straw was Mrs. Gable, her elderly neighbor. Mrs. Gable was kind, but frail, and had recently had a fall. She was in the hospital and her prognosis wasn't good. Her apartment, next to Eleanor's, was quiet and dark. Eleanor missed their brief chats over the balcony railing. One evening, overcome with a wave of loneliness and perhaps a misguided sense of wanting to fix things, Eleanor took out the pencil. Her intention, she told herself, was good. She began to draw Mrs. Gable, not in a hospital, frail and sick, but as she remembered her from a few years ago, vibrant, tending her flowers, smiling. She drew her healthy, happy back in her own apartment, pottering about. She drew her well. She left the drawing on her table and went to bed, a strange mixture of hope and dread churning within her. The next morning, there was a commotion in the hallway. Paramedics. The superintendent looking pale. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Mrs. Gable was back in her apartment, exactly as Eleanor had drawn her, dressed in the clothes she'd worn a few years ago, a trowel in her hand as if she'd just come in from gardening. She was smiling, a serene, vacant smile. But she wasn't moving. She wasn't breathing. She was perfectly, flawlessly, lifelessly there, like a beautifully preserved doll. The paramedics were baffled. The hospital confirmed Mrs. Gable had passed away peacefully in her sleep there, hours before. There was no logical explanation for how her body, dressed differently, could be back in her locked apartment, posed as if in life. Eleanor stumbled back into her own apartment, her legs shaking. She looked at her drawing of Mrs. Gable, healthy and smiling, and then at the pencil lying beside it. The carved smile on the wood was wider than ever, a grotesque, triumphant rictus. It wasn't just replacing objects anymore. It was replacing life with a perfect, static, drawn version. It was taking the essence, the soul, and leaving behind an empty, beautifully rendered shell. Horror, stark and absolute, washed over her. What had she done? All those little wishes, those harmless creations, What was the true cost? Where did the old air conditioner go? The chipped mug? Where was Patches, the terrier? What happened to the reality Mark had left behind? The pencil. It wasn't a tool of creation. It was a tool of erasure, of horrifying, perfect replacement. And it was feeding on her will, her desires, twisting them into monstrous parodies. She grabbed the pencil, her hand trembling. She had to stop it. She had to undo it. But how? Could she draw the pencil gone? Could she draw herself before she ever found it? What would that mean? What reality would she be overwriting? The smile, the tiny wooden smile, seemed to mock her, to dare her. It knew she was trapped by the very power it had given her. Eleanor stared at the pencil, then at her own empty hands. The possibilities, the horrors of what she could still draw, or what the pencil might compel her to draw next, stretched before her like a dark, endless canvas.